So today is a concept which I dreamt up this afternoon while walking the dog and listening to this record, streaming it on my phone. This is Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms, one of the most recognisable albums of all time. And I was listening to it, hadn't heard it for a long time, and I was really enjoying it actually. I know this record comes in for a bit of stick, but I do find it quite enjoyable, quite nostalgic. Now, it was the first track on the album which got me thinking about this theme. The song So Far Away, which is quite a bluesy, minor key song. It kind of drifts, it's quite dreamy sounding. And it got me thinking about a conversation that I'd had with John Heaton, and it was to do with the album Cloud 9 by George Harrison, so I'll show that now. Now, John has always said that he doesn't think that the opening track, which is the title track of the album, Cloud 9, really is a very good opening song for the record. And I can kind of see his point really. It's a very minor key, bluesy kind of song. This is what got me thinking, this is what forged the link in my mind between So Far Away, which is the opening track on Brothers in Arms, and Cloud 9, both quite similar, both from the same period really as well, you know, mid to late 80s, both by notable guitar players, and it's interesting how they both chose to start their records with a fairly downbeat track and maybe not the most obvious choice, and that got me thinking about this topic of albums that start with the wrong song. And I guess this is very subjective, highly subjective, and maybe it's a bit of a negative way of looking at it. Perhaps another way of casting it would be albums which avoid starting with the most obvious track. So for example, Cloud 9, there are some songs that would be more obvious in terms of being the opening track. I know that John always says that Fish on the Sand, which is the third track on side 1, would be a much more upbeat way to begin. Of course, you've got the two big hit singles on this, When We Was Fab and Got My Mind Set on You. There's quite a few albums in history which start with the big hit, and I think there's a certain logic to that, I suppose. But George clearly had decided to not do that. He went with Cloud 9, which is this very minor key thing. Same for Dire Straits. I mean, track 2 of this record, of course, is Money for Nothing, and when that came on today, really, I thought to myself, God, that would make a really amazing album opener. You know, the way it starts with the drifting synths and all those electronic drum fills, and then the I Want My MTV thing. It sounds like a great album opener that never was really, and it really does make you wonder, you know, was it a deliberate ploy to avoid the obvious? Let's stick So Far Away on as the opening track and then go for the big exciting one. So what I thought I'd do is try to find some other records that do this, where the opening song is maybe quite slow, quite moody, not the most obvious album opener, and then track 2 is more like the one that you'd expect to be the opening track of the record. Now, as usual, the litmus test that I applied to this was, could I find 10? And I have found 10 in addition to those two. So if we count those two as the first two of the 10. So I've got 8 more to show. So this one sprung to mind. Peter Gabriel, his huge breakthrough album, So, from 1986. And I guess the most obvious track to begin this album would be Sledgehammer, which is a very upbeat, bouncy kind of song, obviously a massive hit single. Track 2 on the record, of course, the album starts with a slow, moody song called Red Rain, which has a certain majesty to it, but you know, you could argue it's not the most obvious idea for an album opener, and if he'd gone with Sledgehammer, it would have maybe got the record off to more of a whiz-bang kind of start. Like I said, it does make you wonder whether, maybe even in the 80s, there was a deliberate strategy. People decided to try and get their albums off to more of a sort of smouldering, slow, moody kind of start, and then for the second track, you know, really sock home with something very upbeat. This one again from the 80s, The Police and Ghost in the Machine. This is quite a good example because this album starts with Spirits in the Material World, which was a single, of course, was a hit single, but it's quite a downbeat kind of song really. It's not a slow song, but it's quite moody. It's got quite a negative lyric in a way. It's nothing like as obvious a album opener as track 2, which is the second hit single from this record, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, which is an absolutely glorious pop tune, and in many ways would have been the more obvious choice. But I guess maybe sometimes artists don't want to get their album started with the big crash bang wallop opening song. Maybe they want to have something slightly more low key, and then come in with the knockout punch track 2. I don't know, what do you think? It's interesting just how many of these records come from the 1980s. This one, Now and Then, Robert Plant, which was his fourth solo album, came out in, I think, 87 or 88. And this track starts with a slow, moody song called Heaven Knows. Back in the day, I did always used to think it's an interesting choice for an album opener. You could have gone with any number of songs. Tall Cool One, which is the third song on side 1, is a really great rollicking song and would have been a great way to kickstart this record. But even track 2, going back to this idea of track 2 being the one that got away, Dance on My Own, I think is a more commercial, has a more upbeat commercial kind of sound to it than Heaven Knows. Interesting he went for Heaven Knows first and then Dance on My Own. What's going on here? Is it a conspiracy? Let me know what you think. Am I barking up the wrong tree? This one sprung to mind as I was just literally flicking through the records trying to find a couple of other things, and this one jumped out at me. I was like, it's another one. Now this is not the 1980s, this is 1979, so it's nearly 1980s. This is the second Van Halen album, of course. Now on the back it says songs, and then the first song listed is Dance the Night Away, which is probably the most commercial song on the record. It's very tuneful, it's got some great harmonies. Was it a single? Might well have been a single. However, it's not the first track on the album. The first track on the album is the cover version of Holland Dozier and Holland's You're No Good, which, guess what, is quite a sort of slow, bluesy, moody kind of song. And then Dance the Night Away is track 2. So there was yet another example. This one maybe not hugely dramatic as an example, but it is one that occurred to me. Madness, The Rise and Fall, which is quite a downbeat album, quite dour in places. However, it does boast the huge hit single Our House, which is the opening track on side 2, and I guess that's fairly common, the idea of leading off side 2 with a really great track. But this album starts off with a song called Rise and Fall, which is the title song of the record, to be fair, but it is quite a moody, dour kind of song, and not the most obvious choice. Track 2 is Tomorrow's Just Another Day, which is much more bouncy, much more upbeat, sounds more like a classic album opener. So there we go, another 80s example. What was that, 83 I think. I couldn't find the vinyl for this. It's in a box, which is hard to get to, so I'll show the CD. Squeeze, East Side Story, Squeeze, Sweets from a Stranger from 1982. Another 80s one, and track 2 of this record is I Can't Hold On, which does sound like a sort of just an absolute textbook album opener. It's big, it's bold, it's bouncy, it's quite commercial sounding. It wasn't a single, but it does sound like it should be leading off the record. However, it's track 2. Track 1 is Out of Touch, which is, guess what, a slow, moody, slightly self-absorbed kind of song, really. It's got a bit of a synth arrangement to it. It's not really classic Squeeze. I Can't Hold On, even though it's maybe not a brilliant song either, it does sound more like classic Squeeze, really. But yeah, why did they put them that way around? Why start with the slow, moody one and then go into the big, exciting one? Answers on a postcard. And this one, again, came to me as I was going through the shelves. Jellyfish, the 90s, how do you describe them? Power pop band, I suppose. Came way before their time was due. Great album this, Belly Button from 1991, I think. And there's all sorts of tracks that could have made really good, bouncy, upbeat opening tracks on this record. That Is Why, which is the second song on the album, would make a great album opener. But then you've got The King Is Half Undressed, which is absolutely fantastic. It would have been a real kind of bolt out of the gate, horse out of the gate kind of moment. And the stuff on side 2 as well, which would have worked really, really well. Stuff like Baby's Coming Back, which is an extremely upbeat and tuneful song. However, guess what? They go with probably the moodiest, slowest song on the record. The first track is The Man I Used to Be, which I think is probably the weakest song on side 1. And yeah, like I said, quite moody. Track 1, side 1. And we'll finish with one which I'm sure people will say is totally sacrilegious, and I'm really only throwing this one in really to be provocative. But it did kind of spring to mind really. The Beatles, Beatles for Sale from 1964, 65. And this song famously starts with a trio of slowish songs. You've got I'm a Loser is track 2, Babies in Black is track 3. Track 1 is No Reply, which is definitely quite a moody, melancholy kind of song. It's not what you traditionally think of as being an album opener in the grand Beatles tradition. You know, think of I Saw Her Standing There on the first record, on Please Please Me. You've got It Won't Be Long on the second album, A Hard Day's Night on the third album. So it doesn't really follow that tradition. Were there any songs on the record which could have made more traditionally upbeat songs? I guess you could have started with Rock and Roll Music, but I guess starting with a cover is a bit dodgy. Side 2, track 1, 8 Days a Week, really would have been a more logical way to open the record, but they decided to stick that on the start of side 2, which I think is a strategy, you know, a bit like the Madness one. Starts with Rise and Fall at the start of side 1, which is quite a moody song. Turn over side 2, that's where you find Our House, the first track on side 2. Anyway, am I going mad? Is this something? Is this real, or is this just in my head? Was there a tendency back in the day for artists to choose the less obvious song, the moody song, and then maybe follow it up with the second track, or maybe the first track on side 2 with the song which you'd think that would probably be the opener in another world? Let me know what you think, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.